Boom. That is my voice. That is an 808 made from my voice. Boom. And today we're going to learn how to turn vocals into 808s. Stay tuned. Listen to this, you feel me? So powerful. Learning every day, yeah. So powerful. Yahweh is the source, yeah. So powerful. Come and join me here today. Powerful. So the first step in making 808s out of your voice is you need to make a sound. And it could be any sound. I think some guidelines I would put on it would be, it would need to be some punchy type sound, something that has a very plosive like sound at the beginning. So words or sounds that contain a P or B or a D sound, something that has a crisp, defined beginning. And the second thing I would add is something that has a hum or resonant hum to it. Like something like that. So words that could kind of help do this are like boom, boom, poof. Little things like that. Palm. Mess around with words and see how you get along. It could be an interesting journey. Maybe try words that have a soft beginning, like foot. Good. And see how you get along. But yeah, with whatever we're gonna try, we're just gonna, you have to record a sound. That's the requirement. You need a sound. So yeah, without further ado, boom. Once you have recorded your sound, obviously remove any gaps from it. So I've just deleted some unnecessary sounds at the beginning, but it won't be necessary within this next step. Something that I will say before we move on is you could, if you so wanted to, you could also tune the sound if you feel like you want to do that. Sometimes I use RayTune or an auto tune plugin to kind of tune the sound if I'm making it a long note. So that's also something to keep in mind. But we're just going to mess around with a simple short sound and see how we get along. Okay, now that we have recorded our sound, we're going to import it into RS5K. And for this section, I have NVDA routed because I feel like if I explain this process, it may sound a little bit convoluted. So to avoid that, I would just rather explain it.
2-1 item.
With NVDA. First thing first, make sure you have an instance of RS5K on a new track. So just hit Alt-I and hit the letter V to select a VST and import an instance onto a new track. And then once you have your RS5K on a new track, then you can just go to your original sound track, your original vocal track.
2 boom voice 1 item.
Which is this one, and select your item by hitting Control left or right arrow to find the item.
102-230,005.
And we're going to hit Shift A to select the item.
1 item selected.
Now, once you have your item selected, scroll down to your ReaSamplomatic track.
3 armed ReaSamplomatic 5001 item.
And forgive me if I'm using RS5K and ReaSamplomatic interchangeably. They both mean the same thing. So thought I would just give that clarification if you ever get confused. But once we're on this track, just hit F.
FX :
to enter the effects window. And from here, we're going to Shift Tab.
Remove at 0%. Release left parent. Note that custom 1. Browse. Import item from arrange button.
Until we find this button. So this button is what allows you to import audio items or audio files that are in Reaper into RS5K without having to use the Browse button, which is the button that's right next to it.
Browse button.
This is the button that you would use if you want to import stuff that is external to Reaper. Once you have Shift Tab until you find this button,
import item from arrange button,
then you can hit Shift Space.
Pressed.
Once you have done that, you can just hit Alt B or just start tapping your MIDI controller to see if your sample has been imported. So I'm going to hit Alt B to turn on my virtual MIDI keyboard.
Virtual MIDI keyboard.
Boom, 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 boom. it has been imported. So that's an easy way of wanting to do that, especially because we're going to be using our entire keyboard to play our 808 sample. I didn't want to use the MPL script this time around, but if you want to use the MPL script to import it just quickly, you can do that as well. And the info for that is in the description below. Anyway, now that we're here, another thing that I do to make RS5K usable to me when I'm going to play out my 808 samples is change some of the settings within RS5K. So this next part is just me going through some of the settings I change.
3-arm.
So first things first, I'm going to hit P to open up the parameters list.
FX parameters dialog plus 0.0 dB.
And because we only have an instance of RS5K on this track, it will drop us directly into the parameters list by default of the plugin. So once we're here, we can just hit S until we hear
Sample start offset left paren, 14 right paren.
sample start offset. And if you hit S again,
Sample end offset left paren, 15 right paren.
you'll also find its fellow offset slider end offset. So sample start and end offset are two sliders that are located in the parameters list window, and they help in changing the beginning position and the end position of your sample, which you have imported into ReaSamplomatic. If you wanted to cut out an unnecessary gap that is at the beginning of your sound, or even at the end of your sound, you can go in here and change the slider position to be further in the sound, in the sample, so that it cuts out that unnecessary gap or unnecessary noise that you don't want to be playing through. Another slider that you would need to select in this parameters list is if you hit the letter O.
Obey note dash offs left paren, 12 right paren.
And this is also important because if you are playing out a sample for the first time in RS5K, by default, RS5K plays the sample for the entire length, regardless of how long you hold the key out for. So if you just lightly tap the key, it's going to play for the entire length, which is not what you want. But this slider allows RS5K to play the sample for the amount of time you hold the key out for. If you were to tab here,
Value colon, slider 0.
You can just hit Control Home to go up to 1.
1.
And this will activate Obey Notes Off so that RS5K only triggers the sample for the amount of time you hold the key out for. So if you hold the key out for a quarter note, it will play for a quarter note. Now that we have those settings changed,
Audio.
we can go into the effects window to go for our final setting. In the effects window, we're going to shift tab until we find the mode combo box.
Remove button. 0. Cache set. Resample. Loop check. Obey note. Resample.
Actually,
Obey note dash offs checkbox checked.
Here's the Obey Notes Off checkbox, which is the same thing as the slider in the parameters list. The start and end offset sliders are not in the effects window. You have to go through the parameters list to access them. So yeah, that's all I need to say about that as well.
Loop. Resample mode. Cache sample. MB4. Mode colon. Combo box sample left paren. Ignores MIDI note right paren. Collapsed.
And this is the combo box that you would go to if you want to change the pitch shifting algorithm that is used to pitch shift your sample across your MIDI keyboard. By default, it is set to sample, which just means regardless of what key you hit on the keyboard, it will not change the pitch of the sample, which is good for like kicks and snares, but it's not good if you're wanting to make melodic 808 patterns. There are two pitch shifting modes that change the pitch. One is above this one, which is
freely configurable shifted.
Freely configurable shifted, which just gives you more flexibility in terms of how you go about pitch shifting. There appears two sliders when you have it set to this mode that basically set a pitch range that you can manipulate your sample within. But we're not going to use this one. We're just going to arrow down until we find
note left paren, semitone shifted right paren.
Note semitone shifted, which is going to take the sample and pitch shift it up and down across your MIDI keyboard by a semitone in either direction. Now hit Alt B, or you can just start tapping your MIDI controller, and your sample will now change with every key press on your keyboard. And there you go. Okay, so for this next section, I'm going to be messing around with the ADSR sliders that are in RS5K. And ADSR is just an acronym that stands for Attack, Decay, Sustain, and Release, which are 4 different sliders that affect 4 different aspects of the amplitude of your sound source or your sample. And there are some links in the description below in regards to my brief research on ADSR. So some videos and an article that I read to kind of just give myself a reference as to what the different sliders do. But yeah, I'm going to go through each of the sliders in turn and show you how they affect the sound, and probably use these sliders to do some preliminary noise shaping of the sample before we apply any EQ or distortion. First things first, attack, decay, sustain, and release are measured differently. Attack, decay, and release are measured in milliseconds. Sustain is measured in dB. So for attack time is the time it takes to go from an amplitude of 0 or no sound to full amplitude or at 100% amplitude. And an attack time of 0 or 0 milliseconds in the case of RS5K, it will just go directly to full amplitude whenever you press a key. Example. There's no hesitation, there's no wait or gradual slope up. If you have an attack time of, let's say, 2000 milliseconds, you can now hear that it's now taking some time to slope up to full amplitude. So depending on what you're wanting to do with your 808 sound, you can probably have a more gradual slope, or you can have a more immediate steep slope up to full amplitude. The next slider is decay, which is the time it takes to decay from full amplitude to the sustain level. And by default, it's probably not gonna make a big difference if you adjust the decay time, unless if you adjust the sustain level. So I'll address the sustain level here as well. The sustain level is the level at which the amplitude will be sustained for a sample or a sound source whenever you're holding out a key past the initial attack and decay time. So you can set your sustain volume to be lower, and I'm gonna set it to like somewhere around -8 dB. And we're now gonna mess around with the decay time to see how it has affected the sound source. So by default, decay is set to 250 milliseconds. So it's gonna take 250 milliseconds to decay down to the sustain level. So we're gonna press the key. You're probably not gonna hear much of a big difference. Let me shorten the decay time a little bit. Let me lower it down to -19 dB. So as you can kind of hear, it lowered the volume of the entire sound because we shortened the decay time. But if we raise it up a little bit, so if we hold it out for a very long time, the initial boom is captured within the initial attack and decay, and then it's kind of fading out the longer we hold out the key. I think I'm gonna leave it here because when I mess around with the release time, it's gonna sound pretty cool. So, but that's what decay and sustain do. You have to adjust the sustain level in order to get the decay to work. Otherwise, it's gonna just decay to the same volume, because a sustain of 0 is just the same volume as the initial attack in decay. So it's not gonna be a big difference. Okay, so release time is the time it takes to decay from sustain level to 0. Lower release times make for more abrupt stops. So if you can hear that, it's stopping automatically once I release the key. If you don't want that, you're going to have to raise the release time, which actually makes for some interesting results. So if I raise the release time to, let's say, 200 milliseconds, it kind of has what I can only describe like as a resonant tail. So once you released it, it still resonates out a little bit longer past the time you hold out the key. So higher release times make for more resonant tails, which I've kind of noticed if you are making 808s, depending on how high you have your release time, will make for some good results. So I'm going to probably boost this up maybe to 500 milliseconds, see how we like that. So I don't know if you can hear that. That's the release tail, where it's kind of like trailing off. It's delaying its end by 675 milliseconds. So if you can just mess around with these sliders until you feel like you like the initial sound you get before you process it via EQ and distortion. But I think I'm good with these. Maybe I would raise the sustain a little bit. Maybe I'll lower it down a little bit. So the settings I ended up with for my ADSR sliders are as follows. Attack time is 0 milliseconds. Decay time is 155 milliseconds. My sustain level is negative 16.5 dB. And my release time is 609 milliseconds. And now we can go on to our next step. So for this next part of the tutorial, it's kind of more so like a breakdown than me messing around with stuff, at least to begin with. But the plugins that I instantiate after I have done some noise shaping via ADSR within RS5K is EQ and distortion. So I have an effects chain where I have an instance of ReaQ, which is Reaper's inbuilt equalizer. And then I have an instance of JS Distortion, which is a stock JS plugin that comes with Reaper. And this is just default settings, the settings that I initially ended up with the first time I created my 808s effects chain. It doesn't mean that it is the end point for this sound, because each sound that I've made has been completely different every time that I've made an 808. But let me add my 808s chain and we can just go through the plugins in turn, the band settings, and then afterwards we're gonna mess around with creating designing the 808 just to make it sound more pleasant to the ears. So here's the effects chain. So something to begin with is you can change the position of your distortion and your EQ on your effects chain. That is with my distortion before the EQ. This is with my distortion after the EQ. So first things first, I'm going to focus on ReaEQ. Basically, there are 3 bands that I have. So my first band is a band filter set at around 55 hertz with a gain boost of 4.8 dB, and it has a bandwidth of 0.87. And this is just to boost the sub frequencies that are normally present in like kick and 808s, to just kind of give it that low end thump that you normally would associate with an 808. Same thing as I talked about in the other tutorial about lo-fi percussion. Narrow band and high enough boost just so that it can accentuate that fundamental frequency within the sub-bass low end. My second band is a low-pass filter at around 2,927 hertz, and it has a bandwidth of 2.0 in terms of octave. And this is just to cut out any frequency above like around 3K. You could go lower, you could go higher, depending on how much of the signal you want to pass through. But basically, 808s take up the low end, therefore, they don't need much high end frequency content. And my third band I have is a band filter set at around 1,111 hertz with a band gain of negative 5.4 dB and a bandwidth of 1.12 in terms of octaves. So it's doing a broad cut or attenuation of the frequencies around that range. And as far as output gain, we boost the output gain to around 7.5 dB. So that way it kind of firms up the sound as the signal is being passed through the EQ. Now let's move on to distortion. For this plugin, JS Distortion, which comes stock with Reaper, there are 4 parameters: gain, hardness, max volume, and channel mode. Gain, self-explanatory. It's just the amount that you're boosting the signal by as it's being passed through the plugin. It has a minimum value of 0. The highest volume is 50, and it's measured in dB. Hardness is basically how hard the signal is being clipped by the plugin, and it goes from a value of 1 to a value of 10. And max volume is, I guess, a threshold under which distortion gets increased. The range is from 0 at the highest to negative 40 dB at the lowest. And channel mode is what channel you want to hear the distortion on: stereo, right, left, and that's it. I'm going to actually mess around with the distortion first and see what happens. Okay. So that's hardness. Now I boosted it up to 10, and therefore, because it's too distorted or it's clipping hard, it's not allowing much of the signals to go through. So I'm going to back down. Now max volume, let's see. I'm feeling tempted to just move around the distortion to be before the EQ. Maybe I should low pass it a little bit more. Let me see. Let me see what happens if I boost the max volume. Let me reduce the release time. So one thing I guess you could take away from this is the higher you go, the more vocal it sounds, but the lower you go, the more it actually sounds like an 808. Okay, so on some brief experimenting, I have done a couple of things within this time. So I just mainly moved the distortion before my EQ, and I've changed some of the settings within the distortion and the EQ respectively. So for distortion, I have my gain set to 21 dB. I have my hardness slider set to 3.0. So it's doing a moderate amount of clipping of the signal. And my max volume threshold is set to negative 25 dB. So at this threshold, it's applying a bit more of the distortion, but there's still a moderate amount of the natural signal still passing through. Channel mode is still set to stereo because I don't want to have it only distorting one side of the signal. For my EQ, I have my first band set to 76 Hertz. It's still a band filter, and it's now boosting 6 dB of gain, and it still has a bandwidth of 0.87. And for my second band, I have a low pass filter set around 2100 Hertz, and it still has a bandwidth of 2.0. And my third band is a band filter set around 1.2K Hertz, 1200 Hertz, and it has a band gain of 1.5 dB. So I decided to change it from cutting to boosting, and the bandwidth is set to 1.05. Just a minor tweak in the bandwidth. And the output gain is still set to 7.5. So that's about it for that. I think I'm going to mess around with adding some other plugins, so other effects. So let's try and see what happens if I add JS pitch an octave down. JS pitch an octave down. Let's see. Let me put it between the EQ and the distortion, or maybe even before that. Let's change the wet and dry mix. I'm gonna mess around with the distortion a bit. One more time. Okay, let me see if I could try Waves J37 plugin to see what happens. So that's something I like to try from time to time, is like it does some weird analog-y type effects, and sometimes it just adds some very interesting coloration to the sound. So let me see what happens. Ah, there we go. Yeah, that's what sounds like an 808. So I kind of ended on this sound. So the effects chain that I have on my 808 track is as follows. After my instance of RS5K, I have an instance of JS pitch an octave down, which basically takes your audio file and creates a copy and pitches it an octave down. And then after that, I have an instance of Waves J37 plugin, basically doing its analog effect on the output and the pitch down output. And I have it set to the metal drum loop preset. And then after that, I have my distortion. And then after that, I have ReaEQ, just EQing everything and firming up the sound. And that's it. Nothing else to explain. So with that, we're going to probably just create a beat and then go from there. Let's see. Okay, I think I got it now. I'm gonna raise the attack a little bit. Let me reduce the release time. Let me add add some reverb. Let me make some hi-hats. Oh, I found something interesting. If I adjust the hardness, if I change the channel mode from stereo to, let's say, right or left, and then all of a sudden I change the hardness slider, it causes the distortion to change channels. So this is 1. And then if I move it up to 4, it starts moving the opposite direction. So that's interesting. Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop moving, don't stop, don't stop, don't stop moving, don't stop, don't stop, don't stop moving. Don't stop, don't stop. Finish. Woo! Finally. We have reached the end of our tutorial. And overall, hope you enjoyed this tutorial and hope it has been helpful to you. Hit the like, hit the share, hit the subscribe, and definitely make sure to check out the resources below in regards to ADSR, RS5K, anything related to Reaper accessibility below. And I also want to give thanks to Chesso for, I didn't mention this before, but he also helped in clarifying my understanding in regards to ADSR. And there are some links to some things that he has done on the global voice, as well as just RS5K as well. So overall, keep safe, shalom, and as always, peace. Enjoy the beat. Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't stop. Dearly departed, always sincere, living life. Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop moving. Don't stop until you start doing. Don't stop until you finish what you started. Oh, don't play dearly, you're departed. Pardon if I'm walking fast, I can't waste time. Can't do that to waste my life. Not a good feeling if I ain't gon' lie. Moments of silence for the moments that died. Time is ticking yet I gotta learn today. Pray that I practice what I preach, that I may earn today. Take no acts out of practice, that I may not pay the price, cause I don't wanna waste my life. Riches of me, that time may not lose life. You feel me, may I keep moving to the finish line. Yeah, got it. Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop moving. Don't stop until you start doing. Don't stop until you finish what you started. Oh, don't play dilly. Don't stop moving. Don't stop until you start doing. Don't stop until you finish what you started. Oh, don't play dilly, you're departed.